Hello and welcome to Planet 40k, I'm Eugenio, and in this video we're going to paint a Blood Angel Space Marine. First up, I cleaned up and assembled the model. To do this I've got a few tools that I used. Clippers to take the parts off the sprue, a hobby knife that comes in handy if you need to shave off big bits or mould lines, some nail files for rough sanding, and some very fine sandpaper that I mentioned in the previous video for smoothing out any rough patches. I've also got some plastic glue from Revell. This glue has lasted me for years, and although it does clog at times, it's still going strong. You just have to make sure you keep the lid on and it's all good. I used to use GW plastic glue, but I had an unopened bottle completely dry out on me before, and it's not the cheapest. I've also got the pin vise or hand drill that's useful for drilling gun barrels or holes for magnetizing. After gluing down the basing materials, I primed the miniature with Citadel Chaos Black Primer and Army Painter Dragon Red Primer from above. This is a method I've wanted to try for a while, and the idea is you get a nice transition between the shadows and the highlight on the armour. Normally people use white for this type of zenithal priming, however as I've already got a can of red spray and I'm painting Blood Angels, I thought this would be a good starting point. I do love these Army Painter colour primers, as you can get the armour on a model done in one spray. Make sure you give the cans a good shake before you use them to get a smooth finish. I'd recommend putting on a timer for about 2 minutes just to make sure you do enough. A word of warning with the Army Painter spray, it doesn't seem to like short bursts, and doing so gives a really grainy finish. I'd recommend keeping the trigger pressed down and use a sweeping motion to keep it from clogging the detail. You should end up with something like this, where the underside is black and the top of the miniature is red. The next step is to add all the base colours to the model. I started with Abbadon black and used this to paint the chainsword, gun and backpack vents. Make sure you thin down your paint slightly with water to ensure a smooth finish. Move quickly and carefully and avoid brushing over parts you've already done. If it's still translucent, then you can go back and give it another coat once it's dried. Next I gave a coat of Mournfang brown to all the leather and gold details. The reason I based the gold parts with brown is because the gold paint covers brown better than black, meaning you don't have to do as many coats to get a solid colour. Next we've got all the silver parts of the model. I did the chainsword teeth, gun and grenade in Leadbelcher. I then based all the gold parts with Balthasar gold. Make sure you give all these paints a good shake before use, especially the metallic colours. I hadn't used one of these gold paints for a while and it had split so badly that shaking didn't quite do it, so I had to use the back of a brush to stir it back to life. Next we've got Ushabti bone and Screamer pink on the purity seal. I normally like to do wax parts in red, however this time I thought pink would stand out more against the red armour. At this point I realised I had forgotten the piping on his joints, so I went back and gave them a coat of black. Once all the base coats were done, I went on to washes. I mixed up Nuln oil, Agrax Earthshade and water in equal parts. I then gave the whole miniature a coat with this mix. The idea behind thinning the washes is that you bring all the base coats together while not dulling the model too much. After it dried, I felt like I needed to shade some parts even more, so I applied a pure wash of Agrax Earthshade in areas I wanted more depth, mainly the recesses on the model's armour and leather, but also a full coat on the purity seal. I then applied a wash of Nuln oil to all the silver metallic parts, so on the gun, chainsword and grenade. The next step is to brighten some of the parts of the model without going into the recesses and spoiling the shade you've just put on. I started with Gehennas gold on the gold details, which is a brighter shade than Balthasar gold. You can use any brighter gold you have really. As you can see, I'm being quite gentle and using the side of the brush to avoid getting any bright gold in the shadows. I would recommend not putting too much paint on the brush, otherwise you risk it seeping into the cracks. Do a light coat with not much paint on the brush, and you can always do multiple coats if you want it to be brighter. Again, I use the same technique on the silver parts with another coat of Leadbelcher, just being gentle with not too much paint on the brush and avoiding the shadows. With the leather parts, I wanted to create a more rough texture, so I decided to use a dry brush highlight of Skrag brown. I applied some Skrag brown to an old dry brush and then rubbed off the excess on a paper towel. Be sure to rub off the paint until there's almost nothing left on the brush. Similar to the metallic parts, you can always add more layers, but correcting a coat that's too heavy is a lot more work. I feel my dry brush on this leather had too much paint on the first coat. I thought I had got most of the paint off, but there was still some hiding in there somewhere. So really make sure your brush is almost dry when dry brushing. After finishing the leather, I went on to the armour. I gave the armour panels a thin down coat of Mehpiston red to brighten them back up a bit, making sure to avoid the recess areas where the washes had collected. I thinned the paint down using water, and the consistency of the paint was somewhere between a wash and pure paint. As the paint is thinned down, it's important to take your time as it's easy for thin paint to run into the crevices, spoiling your shadows. After the armour had dried, I added some edge highlights with Trollslayer orange. I didn't want to spend ages doing this, as you don't want to spend hours painting your troops, so I just picked out a few key areas I thought would look good and provide some contrast. Again, be careful and avoid getting the paints in the recess areas. It's best not to overload your brush with too much paint, as it's harder to paint thin lines and easier for your paint to move into the creases. On sharp edges you can use the side of the brush to get a neat line, rather than painting with the tip of the brush. I was a little bit careless on some areas. I probably had too much paint on the brush, so I went back with Mehpiston red and cleaned up the lines. If you've done some highlights you don't like the look of, you can use this step to erase those too. For the black, I did a few edge highlights of Fenrisian grey. I tried to imagine the light was coming from above and picked out the areas I thought it might hit. So with the bolt gun, it's mostly on the back of the gun. You can use this principle for all your edge highlights, and if you don't like the look of something, just go back with the base colour and rub it out. Next I did some edge highlights on the purity seal with the Ushabti bone and Screamer pink. Again, I tried to pay attention to where the light is and what parts would be in shadow. In hindsight, I could have used a lighter pink to add more contrast to the wax part and show where the light is hitting it. Lastly, I decided to do a quick technique for Space Marine eyes. Using some Ceramite white, I painted 2 lines in the middle of the lens, making sure to avoid the recesses. You don't want to thin your paints too much for this, if at all, to avoid the paint moving around too much. Just take your time, and if you make a mistake you can cover the white with black and start over. Once the white had dried, I thinned down some Elysian green to a wash consistency and applied it to the whole lens. You can use whatever bright green you've got and it should give you this glowing lens type effect. After this step I painted the base and that was pretty much the model done. If you'd like to know how I did this basing scheme, I've got a video on it which I'll link in the description below. So this is the finished model and I'm quite happy with the way it turned out. It's a method you can use to get a decent standard pretty quickly. There are so many ways to paint Space Marines and it's often hard to pick a scheme and method. One thing worth trying is doing a painting test before you commit to painting your whole army. You can do this by buying a cheap box of troops or finding some second hand on eBay or other places online. Make sure you keep a note of what you're doing with each test, and once you're happy you can paint your whole army in batches to save time. If you'd like the list of paints I use for this tutorial, I'll put them in the description below, and if you enjoyed the video please hit the like button to help us promote it and subscribe for more content. If you'd like to support us further, we've got a Patreon campaign with different rewards linked in the description below. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you in the next one.